Hello everyone and welcome to the Nonviolence Now podcast, brought to you by Bene, where we explore the principles of nonviolence, where it all started and how it shows up in today's digital world. Hello everyone and welcome to our fourth podcast episode on countering the authoritarian wave through nonviolent means. I'm your host Layal, and today we have an exceptional guest speaker, Professor Felipe Daza. How are you doing today, Felipe?
Well, I'm doing well. Now again in Paris, for classes in Sciences Po, and I'm very happy to be with you, former student of Sciences Po, one of my favorite ones, and looking forward, for this dialogue.
Right before we jump into our topic, Felipe Daza is a consultant, educator, and researcher in the field of civil resistance, human security, and peace building. For the past 15 years, he has provided strategic support to nonviolent movements in the Mashriq region, Maghreb, Eastern Europe, and the South Caucasus. During this period, he was the co-director of the International Institute for Nonviolence with a Catalan organization called NOVACT. He is currently a professor at Sciences Po Paris and a senior consultant for the United Nations Inter-Regional Crime and Justice Research Institute. Felipe has contributed to the development of human rights monitoring systems in Spain, the occupied territories of Western Sahara, and the South Caucasus region. I know on a personal basis that Felipe has been on the ground in Palestine. He has been also organizing nonviolent movements in Ukraine. It's a pleasure to have you with us to talk about how do we counter this authoritarian wave. Before we really dig into the subject, let's first take a step back and think about what is authoritarianism, because that's a powerful word. Authoritarianism, you have power, there's this sentiment of fear that comes with it, and at least when I come to think about authoritarianism, I think of weaponry, I think of army, I think of security, I think of a monarchy or a very oppressive regime, oppress its people. Before we dig into that, what made you realize that there could be a pathway to counter this wave through nonviolent means?
Well, you already mentioned very key words about authoritarianism. So authoritarianism is about fear. It's about polarizing communities. It's about marginalizing those that trying to lead the communities, and also trying to attack the most vulnerable communities. So it's about fear. It's about injecting fear. And authoritarianism try to divide the people, to gain more power, in order to accumulate more, let's say, political power to achieve their interests. So authoritarianism is an expression of the classical model of power, so this monolithic approach, so it's centralized power from above to the whole society, to have free hands to achieve their military, economical, and social and political goals. That's why today, for example, it's very illustrative to see, for example, Bene, the president of Argentina, taking pictures with some of the most important Spanish banks in Madrid. So there is a very interesting relation going on, and I think it's very important to go deeper and to analyze the relation between the far right and multinational corporations. So I think there is a very symbiotic relationship over there. Saying that, nonviolence is the antithesis to decentralized power, because nonviolence is about people's power, and people's power is about organizing the communities. It's about not a unique leader. It's about multiple leadership. It's about horizontal structures. It's about systems for sharing information and taking decisions, between the whole community. It's about cooperation. It's about solidarity. It's about to be brave and to have unity. So it's the complete opposite, So when we talk about centralized structures in these authoritarian systems, nonviolence is decentralization. It's about sharing power, what we call power with, sharing power between the communities in order to achieve a political goal. But this political goal is not individual goal or profit goal. It's the benefit, the public interest for the community. Public services, distributing the wealth, for the communities, helping the vulnerable communities, creating a sense of belonging to the community. So it's the complete opposite, decentralization and people's power against centralization and power from above.
I think this encapsulates the vision or the idea of authoritarianism. If we were to give the listeners just a few words, like key terms for today's discussion, when we think of authoritarianism, what are the main things we need to think of or we need to consider?
Well, at the end of the day, authoritarianism is basically the idea for political leaders to centralize power, and then to avoid any democratic control. So to reduce the capacity of, for example, civil society to watchdog and to increase the accountability of those that have the power. So it's basically to be able to create a system where there is a huge, I think this is critical, solid security system around the political government to repress the civil society and to prevent that democracy evolve. Because at the end of the day, the democracy is the antithesis as well of authoritarianism. So I would say that if we need to identify key concepts, I will say power centralization, a strong security apparatus to keep the power, okay? I would say corruption. Yeah. I think corruption is a very key element as well. And I would say the complete oppression of the civil society, civic space, disappearance of civic space. And if we take a look, for example, on the rise of authoritarianism in many countries. So the first step that authoritarians are taking when they take government, attacking civil and political liberties, attacking freedom of expression, attacking the right to assembly, attacking those fundamental freedoms of the civil society. Why? Because this is a threat for authoritarianism.
When you mentioned the far right as far right being an antithesis to democracy, and an antithesis to democracy needs something to stand against it so that the people have their own power, right? If I'm restating what you mentioned earlier. But is it just the far right, or are we talking about any polar extreme that is trying to breach democracy or democratic values? Because around the world, there are monarchies, there are dictatorships that are also countering this democratic value, and they do not come from the far right entity. And I can state examples like Iran as a primary one. What do you think about that? Is the priority when looking at authoritarianism, does it have to be linked to the far right because it's linked to multinationals? Or can we also say that authoritarianism can stem from entities that do not come from the far right, but do have expansionist ideological views, and also they are breaching democratic values?
That's a very good question, indeed. I think authoritarianism is, from the Western perspective, we can also have a close link with the far right, but also if we go a bit deeper, we will see there are some conservative values. For example, if we compare authoritarianism in Hungary, or what is happening today in Georgia, in South Caucasus, or even, the rise of Vox party in Spain or in Italy, you can see it's also that behind that there is a narrative, okay? There is a narrative on coming back to traditional conservative values in the society. For example, the role of the family in the society, the religion can be Orthodox, can be Catholic religion, can be Islam religion, So I think that maybe something in common between far right or other groups, is that there is a way back in terms of conservative values.
So the root cause...
The root is conservative. But also, going a bit deeper, I think that there is also a narrative element here, and there is an ideological element. So I think that something that they have also in common is trying to show that there is a threat, to the cultural values of the society. Because the cultural values is what for people make sense, something that they have been living under some specific cultural values. So when they say traditional family value is under threat because the LGTB are going to destroy the whole society, which is, for example, what narrative in Russia, there is this idea of creating an enemy. In the other side, trying to preserve these traditional values, and then from there provide a solution. Say, look, we need to centralize power. We're in a crisis situation. We need to protect ourselves, for example, protecting our borders, expelling the migrants, reinforcing our armies, reducing, civil liberties, because we're in a crisis time. We are in a unique moment, and they're attacked by other external forces. So that's why I think that this element of the othering, and these enemies, plus the idea of traditional values, these cultural values, is very important. At the end, it's an information war, okay? I think that the narrative is really, really important on that. Sometimes even more important than the military struggle or the military defense. So I think that this is also critical. And you will see that the majority of authoritarian regimes or far-right groups or conservative or radical conservative groups, they pay attention to this narrative component and the strategical use of communication, always appealing, to these traditional values, because this is what the people is connected with, this concept of or cognitive framework that people has, and for them makes sense. That's why I think it's important also to pay attention to that.
Thank you so much for this clarification. I think it's just really interesting and important to let these down. There's always something deeper to everything that's happening. There's a deeper meaning, there's a deeper agenda, and there's a purpose to all of this spread. We just introduced to our listeners what we will be talking about today. Let's start with understanding these different crisis situations. So let's talk about collective and integral protection, this notion of politics of care. When we look at this notion, how has it evolved and what is it about?
You mentioned crisis, right? In the last years, we have witnessed different crises. The pandemic was global crisis, no? Which was used by authoritarianism to restrict different values, freedom of movement, also to concentrate more power. We saw also the rise of the tech industry. We saw also the rise of new mass surveillance technologies as well. So crises are used also by those political elites or military elites to take advantage to use it in their favor. We have the war in Ukraine, and now today we are living, an ongoing genocide in Palestine, and also destruction and war in Lebanon and other parts of the world. So I think that we see also like how political and military elites, they're also taking opportunity to increase the military budgets in this process. And I think that you mentioned also in these frameworks, okay, while they are concentrating more power, in the parallel, they are dividing the people. Polarization, again, is a key strategy of authoritarianism. So saying that, and coming back to nonviolence component, I think that when this political elite, that we don't have to forget that we are the 99%, okay? Sometimes we thought that the forces that they have huge power, and it's true, but we are the majority. The problem is that they know that we are the majority, that's why they are dividing us. So in this framework, I think it's important that and using nonviolence and using new strategies to increase our power, we need to be more resilient. And in order to increase our resilience, we need to use approaches, which is, for example, you mentioned the integral protection or comprehensive protection, which is based on the politics of care, right? So it means that we need to focus, in order to be more resilient, we need to focus on the reproductive activity. So it means, like, for example, taking care of the other. So in these moments that we are emotionally, psychologically exhausted, we need also to create networks of support and taking care about the emotional component. Sometimes, activists, we are in the front line trying to cover, and to be in all the struggles, in all the manifestations, in all the demonstrations, and we don't feel it that we are burning out, right? So it's very important also to have our network, our affinity groups, our networks of support to recover emotionally, psychologically, to continue the struggle. So when we talk about this integral protection, it's about having a comprehensive approach to security, from this digital security, physical security, emotional, psychological, and here, the connection with people is very important. So
I'd like to comment on that and say that this is a very, very important aspect that we really have a tendency to disregard often. With the war happening now between Israel and Lebanon, me being abroad, it's been, this politics of care in the sense that we're trying to organize as Lebanese diaspora in Paris fundraiser events, we're trying to take the streets, we're trying to connect with other diasporas from around the world. And, at every second we hear any sort of news, we're talking to these different groups to make sure that all of our loved ones are okay. Mm-hmm. What I found extremely healing about this was once I was reaching out to one of the activists, because now we're coordinating with activists on the ground that are supporting with humanitarian relief to, secure food and basic human necessities for the people that were forcefully displaced from the south. I reached out to one of these activists that's constantly on the ground and being bombarded with everything. I broke down with that person on the phone and I was telling them, it's so frustrating not to be able to be with you on the ground. I'm trying to coordinate, I'm trying to collect funds, but I'm so mentally exhausted because I can't be with you. I can't live what it is that you're living. So I'm just imagining everything that you guys can be going through. And I feel horrible for not being able to be there. And he told me, it's really funny that you people abroad feel all of that guilt and you really want to be here when all of what we're feeling is that we just want to leave because this is not something we want to be doing. We're forced to be doing that because we need to help people around us, but our lives have been forcefully paused. After exchanging, both of us felt so relieved because we both realized that whether we were on the ground or whether we were anywhere around the world, were mentally exhausted because of the same factor. And that in and itself led us to create a group with activists on the ground and with diasporas that are coordinating. And we're like, okay, this group is going to be dedicated to vent. Let's just talk about everything. You want to nag? You want to say something's not okay? This group is made for that.
And this is what we call building power, because in the moment you create positive interactions, you create commitments, you try to have like a safe space where you can talk with your comrade, supporting each other. So you are creating a space where it's a space of power, right? And this is the first step. Imagine, the dots, the small groups that are decentralized in the world supporting Lebanon, the diaspora and people inside. So these dots are interconnected, and this is power, really. Yeah. So we need to think sometimes when we talk about nonviolence. I like one image as well. It's like a superorganism, so every nonviolence group, every safe space where there are these positive interactions, these people's power relationships. This is some sort of, small cells in a whole organism that they are interconnected to each other, and they can work together in different directions, supporting basic needs for the Lebanese people, or advocating to the French government to stop, for example, to export weapons to Israel, for example. No? So I think that strategically speaking, I would say that it's also interesting to have this decentralization, to have these multiple fronts. And at the same time, this is what we call using power, strategically using power for concrete actions. But without building power, without creating this safe space, these strong relationships between the activists, it would be not possible to have enough leverage, to transform the system.
So if we were to sum up politics of care, it involves creating safe spaces. It also involves?
Psychosocial support is key here. To understand that human groups, they have an important dedication on production activities like campaigning, like demonstrations, actions, but also they need to take care about reproduction, which is taking care of the energy of the group, creating, for example, mechanisms to solve conflicts, creating mechanisms, to taking care of the other, to have psychosocial support, to have like rotary distribution of roles. So there is a practical element, so it's about values, but at the same time, it's about concrete mechanisms, concrete protocols, concrete spaces for the people to take care of each other, let's say.
And I think that's really important in a time of crisis. So yes, this reconciliation, although it may sound so bubbly, this idea of, yes, we create these safe spaces, but really, when you know that there's someone you can talk to, and that person is just another person that's experiencing the same thing as you are, I think that creates a huge bond that will help the community as a whole to just heal and regenerate this good energy altogether. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about how do we campaign in situations of backfiring?
The backfire is a key instrument on nonviolence. It was something that was described by authors like Ian Sharp, with the politics of jiu-jitsu as well. Can be also represented as the I don't know if you know the aikido, like the aikido is using the force of the other, right? So it's about being ready for the hit, for the attack of the other, and then try to use this attack for your own favor and to increase your power. So for example, if there were different movements that they happened, for example, if you take a look in, I came to mind Ukraine during the Orange Revolution in 2004, the students demonstrate in Maidan, in Kiev, and there were just hundreds of students that they were with their tents in this public square, and they were protesting for the electoral fraud that happened. The government sent anti-riot police, like hundreds of anti-riot police, and they start beating, the students in that square. And whole clashes or the whole repression was communicated. So this happened at night. At the next day, with the first, news of the day, they were, like all the channels were, describing, the huge repression, and you could see, the whole repression, to the students. So then this was like this catalyzed. It was a tricky event that catalyzed the movement of thousands of people, like organizations, professionals, fathers, mothers, that they joined all in Maidan. So it created the opposite, effect that they wanted to basically repress this students movement, but they create the opposite. So by repressing the vulnerable, the movement increased and it managed, basically to achieve the political goal, the Orange Revolution, the so-called. In other cases, also we need to also be aware about the limitations, no? So I have been working in Palestine or in other countries in the Masrek region, and I saw really in some situations how the backfire was very effective, to increase the power of the community. For that, you need to be ready. You need to have a strong communication system to use this in your favor, and to have good storytelling to explain what was the consequences of this attack. It happened also, that when you put many people in prison, this also creates an effect. You are creating the problem. So hundreds of people are in prison, because the problem. Then you start to dramatize. This is what Martin Luther King was mentioning, no? So sometimes it's important to dramatize the situation, so you are forcing the people to take a stand. You are forcing people to say with whom you are. Yeah. You are with the oppressor, or you are with those that they are affected, or we are victims of this system. So backfire, it creates, if you strategically organize in the correct way, it's very useful for dramatize the situation and pushing the people to take a stand, to take a position. One of the critical elements. However, sometimes again, we see the current situation we see also limitations, because we can see the huge repression by Israel, and we see that sometimes it's not enough. We have a lot of violence. There was many demonstrations around the globe, for supporting Palestine, or today Lebanon, but it's not enough. It's not enough. However, it's happening. There are step by step. There are some steps that are happening, but I don't know. I have the feeling sometimes that it's very, very slow, the process. No, so.
I'm going to touch on what you're giving as an example in terms of digital spaces, and let's elaborate on that with the example that you were just talking about, which is the case of Palestine and Israel. I think these backfires have really started to change the global public perception of what is Israel viewed as and what are the Palestinian people viewed as. And unfortunately, in the case of this ongoing genocide that has been going on for more than a year now, we've been able to see on social media platforms there was this narrative of women and children are dying, putting this as a headline, and the numbers are huge. And then you start to see all of the human rights violations that Israeli soldiers are committing on Palestinian soil in Gaza right now, breaking into people's houses, wearing women's lingerie. We've seen these videos, they're outrageous. You did start to see that with time people started to be more involved and want to know more. We have not seen change yet, but I think this is going to have a very long-lasting impact on how Israel is going to be in the years to come.
I think there is one strategy here that is very important to highlight is citizens journalism.
Yeah.
I mean, all these stories, due to the situation, because the whole blockage of Gaza Strip, of course you have many professional journalists, but many people, Palestinians were the owners of their stories, and they were the ones, conveying their stories. And I think this is very powerful. And this is also one positive aspect of the new media that is emerging, okay? Citizen journalism is very important. And because it's the first person you are talking the story, we have many cases in Gaza or in West Bank or Palestine in general or in Lebanon. And this is super important. At the same time, I think that there are also many threats here. I think that communication today, as I mentioned before, is the information war is essential, is critical. So I think that the whole information and narrative is able to deconstruct, some images. I think that the idea of Israel as a democracy is already, that is completely, deconstructed, and people, many countries start to say, this is not a democracy, it's an authoritarian regime, and look, how they are destroying, the whole societies and ongoing genocide. But I think that we need to preserve these strategies. So preserving this strategy means also to engage in digital organizing. So digital organizing, there was something like concepts that they were, for example, were mentioned by Naomi Klein or Angela Davis during the pandemics. They were mentioned that we need to use better, social media. We need to use better the digital spheres for our political goals, and we need to basically to have a clear understanding of how we can use these tools. I think here I would like to mention that it's very important that activists, while they are continuing their work on citizen journalism, they're also increasing their protection. Digital security is super important. But we have also new tools about open source intelligence. We are creating new infrastructures, security infrastructures to organize global movements. So we need to connect better the online and the offline spheres, to be more effective. The threats are two, in my opinion. One is the mass surveillance, I think, and digital mass surveillance is growing. So we have the case of this Israeli company NSO Group that was used, to target, activists around the globe and political leaders through different spywares, Pegasus. But there are more companies creating this type of, surveillance mechanism. Also, we have biometrics camera, also, and other tools to monitor social media. This is one threat. The second threat is misinformation and fake news. We need to be aware that the social media, some networks are, basically we have electronic armies that are controlling the narrative sometimes, and controlling sometimes the trending topics, and controlling what is mainstreaming. So electronic armies composed by thousands of bots, controlled by one political party or one political actor, by different non-state army actors. Okay, they have their own armies, to digitally harass, online harassment to concrete activists or organizations, to later on legitimize violence attacks to these persons, to these people. These are the threats. So I think digital organizing is something that we need to invest more time to organize better with all the tools we have we can use, but at the same time to be aware about what are these threats.
I think a great example would be, and this is something we discussed in episode 2, Alicia, my co-host, and I, which is the strategy that they used in Hong Kong's movement, the Be Water, My Friend strategy. This would be an optimal case study to look into how it fits in this realm of this online and offline campaign. In our previous episode, we did mention the fact that they would use these different online platforms to communicate. While communicating, they had subgroups that whenever the police would arrive somewhere, they would break down and go to different places, and it would be impossible for the police to keep up with everything that's happening at the same time. But also it did have its limitation on the longer run, but the idea was just so fascinating. I don't know if you have something more you'd like to add on that matter and to try to link it to what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. It's a very good example, which shows also the importance of the online and the offline actions, how to coordinate in a secure manner, using technologies. And it's also a reflection, in my opinion, of what we call the invisible nonviolence, or the invisible resistance. So sometimes when the repression is very high, nonviolence movements or civil resistance go under the table. Or, for example, it happens today, in the occupied areas by Russia in Ukraine. So the resistance is ongoing, but it's more invisible. So just appears at night, and then basically they make a graffiti somewhere, or basically they withdraw one Russian flag from a public building to show that we are still there, but because due to the security situation we need to have these invisible strategies. So how to use, and this is a key point, how to be anonymous,
Yes,
but maintaining credibility. This is critical, because at the end, you need to mobilize people.
Yes.
But if you are mobilizing and people doesn't know who you are, this is a key point. I think one case is very interesting to pay attention. It is called the Tsunami Democratic. It was one also a digital movement created in Catalonia. It was created behind that was the independentist movement, and they created also one Telegram channel. So they create during weeks the confidence, the credibility about that they were, committed activists, and the people start to follow this Telegram channel, and they were providing, some sort of instructions, proposals, recommendations for actions. So you need to build legitimacy, trust, and sort of, confidence, and maintaining at the same time this type of invisibility as well. And then having these actions at the end, no? So you have the digital spheres can provide you with these two dimensions. But at the same time, having concrete directions to have the actions in the offline sphere, let's say.
In that sense, they would be trusting the material that they're providing, the shared values that they're proposing, the alternatives that they're suggesting, without necessarily knowing who the person is, because it doesn't really matter at this point who is the person. It's more about what this person or what this entity is talking to you about.
Exactly.
And over time, you manage to build that trust, which is fascinating. But I think it has its challenges, definitely. If we're looking at it in cases of crisis, for example, to come up with this, it does take time. And if a crisis just suddenly emerges, it's really difficult to build that, don't you think?
Yeah, because in crisis situations, when those conditions that were created are sometimes destroyed, there's this fear and the polarization is higher, and there's more distrust between the communities. People get more afraid to talk in social media or to make a post or go into actions. So one key strategy will be in crisis to rebuild the systems, to rebuild the connections between people. It's what, for example, happened today in Belarus. Okay? So in Belarus, in 2022, there was electoral fraud. There was very well organized. You have Telegram groups of 500 people, and then the regime launched a huge repressive with hundreds of torture cases, and people started to leave the country. A lot of distrust. So these groups that there were maybe 500 people in Telegram groups, they became 50. But now, again, there's a process of rebuilding again this ecosystem, this mega organism of resistance, okay? So we need to also be aware that the crisis moments are moments that we need to go into invisible action, and we need to have maybe to work more on the psychosocial level, support, creating again the support networks to be ready for the next momentum, to be ready for the next, battle.
If we were talking about crisis, let's look at times, I'm not going to say where there is no crisis, I'm going to call it an invisible crisis per se, in the sense that it can be a climate crisis, for instance. It's happening and something needs to be done. And I think we could look at the concept of multinational corporations as a target. And as we've previously started our podcast session by saying the global north, what is the role of the global north? I think it's good to talk about the similar concept of tsunami democratic that you just mentioned earlier. These groups and movements that are there on day-to-day basis, and they're creating this movement of awareness so that when they decide to take action or when something happens, they have the people, they have the capacity, and they go for it. How do nonviolence and social transformation movements like these create these new paradigms against these corporate powers, against colonialism and against capitalism?
I mean, nonviolent movements, they need to be also strategical. Movements have like what we call the long-term vision. They have their vision of tomorrow, okay? What is this type of new paradigms that they need to emerge? For example, in some territories they call ecofeminism, right? So like a new paradigm that can confront capitalism, can confront patriarchy, can confront, colonialism. Like a new system of values. Okay? This is the long term. These values are very important. Okay? Values are important because they give direction to the movement. And these values can be reflected, can be translated into the daily life of the movement by concrete mechanisms. Like, for example, how you are taking decisions. If you are, for example, you really want real democracy is not only about voting, it's also about deliberation, it's about discussion, it's about the battles of ideas. You translate this value into decision-making processes that you don't use voting to take decisions, but deliberation. This is a concrete example. But the second level is to have specific goals. Specific goals that the people are able to understand where you are going, that they can be achievable and they can be tangible. Because if you are talking about, okay, we are going to promote ecofeminism or we want to confront, climate change, people say, well, this is a huge battle, I don't have time. You need to land it with very clearly, with concrete goals. I will give you one example about one of the last reports we are working on. It's about public housing. Public housing is one of the, for example, in Spain is one of the key problems today. And also happening in many other countries and in big cities, like young people cannot afford to pay a rent. Tourism is also, the mass tourism is increasing the price to buy a house, So if you don't have a house, you will not have stability, for example, to create a family or etc. So I think that the public housing is a critical element. It became a source of speculation. So we are targeting public housing as a very critical focus, okay? But behind that, there is other long-term goals. What we are trying to convey is that who is behind the problem is not only the governments, but the big financial institutions like Vanguard, BlackRock, or even financial institutions that are investing in the occupied territories. Okay. In occupation context. So we have Spanish banks that buying, whole buildings for speculation, and at the same time they are, investing in the occupied territories.
That's crazy.
So we, by focusing on a very local issue, we are trying to provide the global picture. Okay, that the financial flows by these financial institutions, they have the same strategy. They have the same predatory strategy. Doesn't matter if there is Barcelona or doesn't matter if this Ramallah or this Jenin. Okay, they want basically to get profit at any cost. So the same that are getting profit from the illegal settlements in West Bank are the ones that are today buying buildings or investing in Barcelona or the cities in Spain, preventing, or provoking evictions, etc. So we try to make this parallelism, and for the people is a very good entry point. Okay, this is something that affected to me in my neighborhood, but the source of the conflict, the global picture, is the occupation of Palestine. So I think that this is also very strategical, no? Because we are living in globalization, and we can see that many of the problems that we are living today are interconnected. Okay, and for example, when there is any privatization of public services, we can see there are multinational corporations behind. When we see also destabilization, war and conflict, is because sometimes multinational corporations they want to destabilize in order to have more freedom or free hands to plan their natural resources. I think these elements about local to the global level, I think is something that we need to work on, and to try to put in our campaigns, let's say.
It's really important and interesting because you think the problem is just one layer, in the sense that, okay, I'm here in Spain, I can't afford my rent, I can't find a place to stay, or I'm being evicted because they want to triple the rent and I can't afford that. To know that the people invested in this building are the exact same people that are investing in illegal settlements in the West Bank. This traceability of trying to find the supply chain of who is behind it really changes the perspective of things, because you have people saying, okay, so we want to make this area more luxurious. This is a pure right-wing argument. We want to make this place cleaner and nicer and fancier, so we're going to make the rents go higher. Mm-hmm. Your argument at that point would be, okay, but I still deserve to live there. But there's no more than that to it, because one can argue people have the liberty to price in the way that they want. But then you tell them, oh, but did you know that these same people that are asking for this are using that money to build illegal settlements? Then the narrative changes completely. And I think, again, here we're touching on the aspect of narrative. This is the trigger point that really shifts the perspective of people and that motivates them to opt for change.
Yeah. And if we come back to the topic of climate change and how to confront that, we can see that in this crisis situation, in this crisis moment, the narrative is that we need the new sources of renewable energy. If you take a look on social media, you take a look at the traditional media, you will see that how businesses, multinational corporations, the ones that they create the problem, are the ones that they say, no, we have new solutions. They want to keep business as usual. Because if you take a look how they are producing these mega projects in Western Sahara, for example, so occupied territories. Morocco is emerging as one of the most committed states on promoting renewable energy for the whole Maghreb region, while they are occupying. And the majority of the renewable energy projects, solar plants, are in the occupied territories, or Israel. Again, also, they are using this narrative as a diplomatic strategy to say, look, we are committed, to provide this new energy, but the majority of these renewable projects are in the Jordan Valley, for example, these solar plants or farms. It's also very important to be very critical about where these solutions are coming from. And that's also something to pay attention as an activist, as a civil society.
So let's talk about moral responsibilities here and rebounds back to the crisis situation. But I don't want to call it crisis because at this point we're talking about war. If we're looking at Ukraine, if we're looking at currently at the moment Lebanon, I'm not going to give Gaza as an example because there's a genocide happening there, but maybe the West Bank as well. I think there's this moral responsibility for all the people that, okay, if we are not living in times of war and we live abroad, What is one very simple non-violent action that one can do? Boycott. So how about we talk just a bit about that, and how can we create this link of civil disobedience and boycott as a confrontation to war and this wave of authoritarianism?
I was going to use the word confrontation, because for me, nonviolence should be now confrontation. I mean, if in fact there are some scholars that talk about nonviolent conflict, to create a distance between pacifism. I think that pacifism is a value. There was also the peace movement had important victories, but nonviolence is not only about pacifism and about demonstrations. I think we need to make a step forward. I think that there is the moment to have confrontation, non-violence confrontation. This means that without using weapons, we have a wide range of actions we can use in order to confront those that have the political power to take the decisions. And then in another level, I think that the non-violence can be very useful to provide solutions to very concrete needs of the people. In this kind of crisis situations, protection is essential. We saw during the occupation of the invasion of Ukraine the important role of the civil society for evacuation, transportation of people from the occupied areas to the safe areas. Or, for example, today we are cooperating with non-violent activists in Palestine, in West Bank, on one initiative called defendpalestine.org in order to send volunteers to West Bank to protect local communities from settlers' violence. We have urgent measures. We need to force Israel to go for a ceasefire in Lebanon and to have a ceasefire also in Palestine. And for that, we need to isolate Israel and to cut the commercial and the trade relationships, but also especially, focus on the arms export. I think without arms exports, Israel will not be able, to have this massive bombing of cities in the Masrek region. It's essential to create global nonviolent movements in US, in Latin America to confront, but having, very direct actions, civil disobedience, boycott actions, huge strikes for weeks in the most important cities, blocking, the infrastructures, public infrastructures, until the government stops exporting weapons to Israel. I think this is something that for me will be critical. At the same time, we have other levels of action that I think is important. For example, in Palestine, we are supporting one action initiative called Farad, which is a protection mission. So it's activists from around the globe are traveling to West Bank to stop settlers' violence. So they protect the communities with physical interposition, by observing, by capturing images, by recording this violence. Also, there is some kind of deterrence strategy as well, because when you have internationals, sometimes there is not this type of violence. Sometimes, yes, it happened. There were attacks to internationals. Even they killed some U.S. nationals. But if we have a huge missions of activists, this will have an effective, deterrence strategy, to the settlers.
As much as military groups need to strategize and come up with solutions and different tactics, the same thing exactly applies to nonviolence. The only difference is that it becomes more difficult because you're not getting rid of people, but you're trying to change this behavioral change and the way of thinking of people, which is much more complex. I salute you to everything that you've been working on. If you were to wrap up with one idea or something maybe that inspires you to keep going, because this is really an exhausting and tiring duty that you have to keep on being persistent, keep moving forward. And I mean, you've been doing this for 15 years plus, and you're full of life, you're full of it, and you want to keep going. What is it that keeps you moving forward?
All the struggles matters. I was working in different contexts with different activists, and always I gained something, always I learned something, and always I established some sort of like a very strong solidarity relationship. So I really think that as a humans, I think that we need to really to support each other and to also to combat in different fronts. So for me, nonviolence is the channel, okay? But at the end of the day, I mean, human life is the main purpose. Nonviolence also is reinforcing communities, reinforcing social emancipation in different contexts, providing, increasing people's power, and practicing democracy, which is at the end of the day is the most important. Practicing democracy, creating unity and solidarity. Some people can be a bit negative about the current situation, but at the same time, I would like to say that the solidarity is growing. So we need to be a bit more strategical, trying to focus more in global campaigns and to have more, concrete targets in order to, as I mentioned before, for example, to stop the armed weapons to armed exports to Israel.
What better way to end such a wonderful conversation but to motivate everyone, our listeners and activists around the world, to not give up and to realize that countering the authoritarian wave has various strategies and they are actually effective and they are implementable. All we have to do is to be consistent, look for pressure points, and form a group based on a set of values and just aim for the moon to make sure that we leave this world better than the way we were brought into it. Felipe, thank you so much for your time today, and I wish you all the luck in everything that you do. Thank you for joining us on the Nonviolence Now podcast. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired. If it did, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your friends and community. Together, let's spread the word about the power of nonviolent action.